With the daily precautions against sun exposure, with the daily warnings of the hazards of sun exposure, and with the daily recommendations of using careful sun protection in all the media around us, should you hate the sun? Life on Earth started and is dependent upon the energy supplied by the sun. Sometimes this energy is strong, is mighty, we should be careful with it. But again, it's generous, giving life to this Earth. Solar energy is essential for life and for health, and when the sun is rare in some areas of the world, a heliotherapy machine like the old one you see in front of you was invented to help people and to treat some diseases. This particular machine was used to treat cutaneous tuberculosis, lupus vulgaris. In the coming few minutes, we are going to try to understand the effect of sun on our bodies. We'll start by revising some of the physical facts about the solar energy and its interaction with our skin, and then the biological effects resulting from this interaction that ends up in some benefits and some hazards. And finally, we will discuss the need and the value of sun protection. First, we need to understand what's in the solar rays. Solar rays are electromagnetic waves loaded with photons, which are quanta of energy, oscillating perpendicular to the direction of the spread of light. This energy component is higher when the waves are shorter. So with the long wavelengths, the energy is less. Each wavelength has a special molecule to target. This is the chromophore. And each molecule in the body favors a special wavelength to attract, which is the absorption maximum. When these energy waves hit the skin, they are either reflected, scattered, or absorbed. The way the skin looks, the way we see the skin, and the way the rays act results from interaction from different rays with different chromophores. Only 5% of the solar energy at the sea level is delivered by ultraviolet rays, and the rest 95% is by visible light and infrared. Of these 5%, only 2 to 5% are delivered by ultraviolet B, while ultraviolet C and shorter wavelengths are absorbed by ozone in the stratosphere and they never reach the Earth. Ultraviolet B, on the other hand, they reach the Earth, but they can be filtered by regular window glass. As is simplified in this diagram, the components of the solar rays, starting with the very short, the gamma and X rays, and ending with the longer infrared and radio waves. The shorter wavelengths have higher energy than the longer ones. The depth of penetration depends on the wavelength. So the ultraviolet B, with its short wavelengths, hardly penetrates through the epidermis, while the ultraviolet A penetrates deeper to the upper dermis, and the visible light and the infrared light penetrate all through the dermis. When the rays hit the skin, they are either reflected from the surface of the skin, stratum corneum, or from the epidermis, or from the dermis, or scattered in the dermis, or being absorbed and share in biological functions in the skin, using the energy to make changes. When a chromophore gets excited by the photon energy delivered to it, this excitement, singlet excited state, lasts for only nanoseconds. Energy is lost to the surrounding tissue by and resulting in one of the four major changes. Fluorescence, as happens with dermal collagen and with light. Internal conversion and denaturation of protein, as happens with laser therapy. Forming a covalent bond resulting in a photoproduct, like what happens with sorrelin DNA complex after stimulation by UVA, or phosphorescence, as happening in porphyria and as it used in photodynamic therapy using aminolevulinic acid and visible light. This diagram shows an excited molecule trying to return to its ground state by losing energy either by fluorescence or phosphorescence or to the surrounding, making a photoproduct. And this diagram is even more simplified. The energy of the ultraviolet and visible radiation gets absorbed by the equivalent chromophore, which gets excited to a higher state, then has to get rid of the extra energy to the surrounding, making photoproducts. The photoproducts, with the biochemical and cellular changes happening, are the prerequisites for the acute and chronic skin responses, whether good or bad. Strangely enough, the benefits of sun exposure seem to be less studied and documented than the hazards. The most important of the benefits are vitamin D formation, tanning, and skin hardening or toughness effect, suppression of local adaptive immune response, which is very important in some diseases like psoriasis and contact dermatitis, boosting of natural immunity, helping to control high blood pressure, improving the mood through increasing brain secretions of serotonin, and the number and sensitivity of dopamine receptors. 80% of our body needs of vitamin D3 are obtained by the interaction of the ultraviolet B rays with the 7-dihydrocholesterol present in the plasma membranes of our skin. This provitamin D produced by this interaction needs isomerization and then hydroxylation in both the kidney and the liver to reach to the final product of the biologically active vitamin D3. Dark-skinned people need more exposure to the ultraviolet rays to get the same effect. This is because of the filtering effect of the melanin in the skin. And people living in temperate zones may use ultraviolet B lamps or heliotherapy devices to get the same effect that should be obtained by the sun when the sun is rare in these areas. Melanogenic factors are produced from melanocytes and the pituitary gland upon stimulation with exposure to sun rays, whether visible light or ultraviolet rays. The melanogenic factors stimulate the melanocytes to produce more melanin, causing tanning, and if there is DNA damage induced by exposure to ultraviolet rays, the melanogenic factors enhance the repair mechanism, so ultimately protecting the skin against the development of cancer by the ultraviolet rays. But within the range of the ultraviolet rays, UVA1, the longer wavelengths, is responsible for the immediate pigment darkening, which is caused by redistribution and oxidation of already present melanosomes. The delayed, more persistent tanning is the effect of UVA2 and ultraviolet B. It starts within 3 or 4 days and is maximum within 10 to 30 days. With persistence of the daily exposure of the suberythema dose to the sun rays, for 2 or 3 weeks, there is increased melanogenesis, and there is also hyperplasia of the dermis, epidermis, and stratum corneum. This results in a thicker, tougher skin. Skin hardening effect is an adaptive mechanism that increases photoprotection of the skin and increases the resistance of the skin to other physical factors. On the other hand, the unguarded exposure to sun rays may result in acute hazards like sunburn, development or propagation of sun-sensitive diseases, photoallergic or phototoxic reactions, or chronic hazards like the photoaging solar keratosis, immunosuppression, development of basal and squamous cell carcinomas. While malignant melanoma, recent research and meta-analysis found no positive correlation between the sun exposure and development of malignant melanoma. But there is a strong positive correlation with development of malignant melanoma on those who used tanning beds, especially at young age before 35. The regulations now ban the use of sun tanning beds to ages below 18 years. Sunburn is the most common acute hazard of sun exposure in skin types 1 and 2. It happens when there is a sharp increase in the dose of ultraviolet rays delivered to the surface of the skin, like, for example, the first day on a holiday on the beach after prolonged winter months with sun deprivation. The working wavelengths here is the ultraviolet B, and the chromophores are the uracanic acid and DNA present in the upper epidermal cells. They result in release of inflammatory mediators like free oxygen radicals, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, lysosomal enzymes, and mast cell mediators, and the end result is the inflammatory response that we see in the sunburn with the first or second degree. The long list of the photosensitive disorders and of the photoallergic and phototoxic reactions is beyond the scope of this lecture. I just included it here for reference for anyone who wants to go for further research on it. But photoaging is an important matter. Photoaging is the most common chronic hazard upon sun exposure. The gentleman that you see in front of you now in the photo shows it all. He was 80 years old and he spent all his life in the sun with no sun protection. He never suffered from sunburn and he never developed basal squamous cell carcinoma. But this is the chronic cumulative effect of exposure to ultraviolet rays, unguarded exposure for long hours all through the years. It shows it all. Clinically, the skin is dry, deeply wrinkled, inelastic, telangiectatic, with irregular pigmentation, freckling, and solar lentions and keratosis. Histologically, there is thick, malformed elastic fibers, degraded collagen, abnormal ground substance, atrophic sebaceous glands with keratotic plugging. And finally, with the immunosuppression induced by the effect of solar rays, the working wavelength here is within the range of the ultraviolet. Basically, the ultraviolet B, with its shorter wavelengths and higher energy, it penetrates only through the epidermis. It affects the keratinocytes and Langerhans cells directly, and the effect on the other cells in the dermis are secondary by the release of mediators from the keratinocytes and Langerhans cells. UVA with its longer wavelengths penetrates deeper, but it's weaker due to the weaker energy content of it. The major effect of immunosuppression here is done by the ultraviolet B rays. Immunosuppression here is basically an adaptive mechanism preventing the development of reactions against photoproduced neoantigens. It is a slow, persistent process. Effect is produced by daily exposure to suberythema dose of ultraviolet rays. The response is genetically determined, and it depends on the slow, continuous release of reactive oxygen species and the clustering of cell surface receptors in immunocompetent cells. The working wavelength here is within the range of the ultraviolet B, and the chromophore is a DNA present in epidermal keratinocytes and dendritic cells and occasional monocytes. This results in the release of immunosuppressive cytokines. This is a slow, progressive process that starts local and may end up affecting the systemic adaptive immune reaction. Mind you again that daily exposure to sun rays boosts the natural, the innate immune response. But the immunosuppression here is directed towards the adaptive immunity. These are some details, and as we explained before, it starts with the keratinocytes and epidermal Langerhans cells, dendritic cells, and then follows with the effect on the macrophages and T lymphocytes, with homing of the T suppressor cells and release of the immunosuppressive cytokines like the interleukin-10 transforming growth factor beta, tumor necrosis factor alpha, and interferon gamma. And this could be summarized in this diagram, showing the keratinocyte and the Langerhans cell as the primary cells to be affected, with the secondary effect on the macrophages and mast cells and homing of the T lymphocytes and release of immunosuppressive cytokines. The major fear here is the induction of malignancy exerted by the effect of the ultraviolet B rays on the skin. Ultraviolet B rays constitute only a tiny fraction of the solar energy delivered to our skin at the sea level, but they do this effect by directly damaging DNA and by immunosuppressing the adaptive immune response in the skin. The power to repair the photo-damaged DNA is genetically determined and is at its best when melanocytes are active, like in dark skin, and at its worst when melanocytes are not, like in skin types 1 and 2. And then we come back to the question, should we love or hate the sun? The answer is not love or hate. The answer is that we have to know the type of our skin and behave accordingly. People with skin phototypes 1 and 2 are very highly at risk of developing sunburn and developing skin cancer later on, while people with darker skin are very low at risk of developing sunburn and skin cancer. People with dark skin are actually encouraged to get some more sun exposure to obtain the necessary vitamin D supply that their body needs, while people of skin types 1 and 2 should be careful in exposing their bodies to the skin, and they should depend on sun protection accordingly. Sun protection is essential for light skin people with skin phototypes 1 and 2, and this is achieved best by avoiding the direct sun exposure and by wearing protective clothing, and then by using the appropriate sunscreen. Mind you, dark skin people should avoid total body coverage with clothing, as they are more prone to suffer from vitamin D deficiency. Sunscreens exert their function by filtering and or scattering the ultraviolet rays. This could be achieved systemically by ingestion of large amounts of beta-carotene from natural sources, or by receiving chloroquine pills under the professional supervision of doctors in some selected patients with photosensitive dermatitis. This could also be achieved by topically applying physical barriers like creams containing zinc oxide or titanium dioxide to form a thick layer that reflects most of the solar rays from the surface of the skin, or could be achieved by applying the more recent and intelligent chemical sunscreens that react with the ultraviolet rays, preventing or lowering their damaging effect on the DNA of the keratinocytes. This is a passive protection that could be boosted by adding antioxidants to stop the DNA damage, or adding liposome containing DNA repair enzymes, or injecting subcutaneously melanocyte stimulating hormone analogues to try to repair part of the DNA damage induced by the ultraviolet ray exposure. Topical organic sunscreens are designed to protect against the deleterious effects of ultraviolet B on the skin. Some may have the additive effect of protecting against ultraviolet B and A altogether. They are further subdivided by the power of protection they offer to the skin when they are applied to it. The sun protecting factor SPF, which may be low, medium, high, or very high. The problem with using these sunscreens is that most of the people using them tend to put less amount than what is recommended by the manufacturer. We should start by putting 3 successive layers of the sunscreen before first exposure to the sun, and this should be renewed every 2 or 3 hours. On the average, an average person on an average day on the beach should use around 100 milliliters of the sunscreen. Being effective in protection to a good degree against sunburn development in people with skin types 1 and 2 when they are exposed to the ultraviolet rays does not mean that they are that effective in prevention of DNA damage that occurs at a subminimal erythema dose of the ultraviolet rays. In fact, they offer some protection against DNA damage and may be beneficial in preventing the actinic keratosis and squamous cell carcinoma. So, people with skin types 1 and 2 should wear protective clothing, wear effective sunscreen, and continue to be cautious with the sun. Moreover, regular daily use of sunscreens may downgrade cutaneous vitamin D formation, and those people may need to regularly monitor their vitamin D and receive vitamin D supplementation. To summarize, white people with skin phototypes 1 and 2 and to a lesser extent type 3 should be careful with the sun. The year-long daily application of high SPF sunscreens deprive the skin of natural adaptive mechanisms and of vitamin D formation. So sunscreens should be used wisely, with medium SPF for average days and very high SPF for days with extra sun exposure. And when sunscreens are indicated, we should use an effective one, and we should use enough amount for it. On the other hand, dark-skinned people with olive, brown, or black skin are more at ease with sun exposure but are more prone to vitamin D deficiency. They should go for daily low-dose ultraviolet ray exposure that corrects vitamin D deficiency, hardens the skin, protects against cancer, photodermatoses, and photoaging. So the answer to the question, we do not hate the sun, we love the sun, but we should also respect the mighty power of the sun. Thank you.